Welcome to the UN Global Compact Academy. I'm Sanda Ojiambo, the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. And today I'm truly excited to welcome you back to our Academy Changemaker series. With this series, as you know, we want to help you learn directly from some of the most innovative and influential people from around the world. Now, our guest today has played a monumental role advancing the UN Global Compact over many years, and he has a truly impressive career pioneering responsible leadership at the front line of business and sustainability as the former chief executive of Royal Dutch Shell, the chairman of Anglo-American, and a member of the board of Saudi Aramco, amongst numerous other global leadership roles. So I'm truly delighted today to welcome my dear friend and the chairman of the Foundation of the Global Compact, Sir Mark Moody-Stuart. Over the next 30 minutes, we will learn about a couple of things. First, we'll hear from Sir Mark about his experience and what that tells us about why responsible business needs to be a priority for all business leaders. We'll also hear about what responsible leadership looks like in troubling times and key considerations for your own response to the current crisis. We'll also learn about what future-proof leadership skills and characteristics look like. To start out, we'd love to know a little bit more about you, Sir Mark, and where your journey for responsible leadership and sustainability began. Sir Mark, welcome. I'd like to ask you, you've had an impressive and illustrious career in many companies, spanning many countries, but is it possible for you to just pinpoint the moment when your journey for responsible and sustainable business leadership began, and what were the circumstances around that for you?
Sanda, it's such a pleasure to meet you in person after 2 years of one-to-ones, board meetings, and so on. Difficult to pin a single point. As you know, I was born in the Caribbean. I was brought up in a colony which has seen enormous change to being an independent company, educated in Britain, a geologist. And then I served with Shell in 10 different countries around the world. And during that process, I saw the impact that a major industry has on a country. Positive impacts, which we're very proud of, but also negative impacts. And it's that interest in development, which has to be sustainable, and sometimes isn't, that really got me going. For example, I worked in Oman in the 60s. In this part of the world. And Oman was a medieval country. And under wise leadership, it developed into a modern, light industrial country with good healthcare and education systems. Malaysia saw similar changes. And those are changes that we as a contributor can be proud of. But I also worked in Nigeria, where the outcomes were not as happy. And if we like to take credit for the good bits, we need to take the blame for the bad bits as well. So it's kind of 40 years of watching good and bad experiments with development that has really sucked me into being interested in it.
Right. And it's really interesting that you highlight that it really is about the good and the bad and you know, owning those and being transparent about the lessons that have been learned from there. Now, I just wanted to reflect on, you know, one of the real seminal moments of the Global Compact, which was its formation. And you were present, I know, in Davos at the time that Kofi Annan gave his speech announcing the formation of the Global Compact. You know, we talked then about the 10 principles, and I wonder, Sir Mark, you know, are the principles still timeless in your view? And do you feel that these principles can still guide us through what we're calling turbulent and changing times?
I think that the 10 principles, which were founded on Kofi's speech, initially human rights, environment, working conditions, and then subsequently, when there was a convention, anti-corruption, are absolutely relevant. And I believe they cover most of the how. And the principles are fundamental to the how. Each company and each person working for a company and choosing which company to work for needs to think about, what am I doing? Nowadays we talk a lot about purpose. The purpose is the what. The principles are the how. It's no good having the most fantastic, effective purpose, which is really doing good, if on the side you're doing it, the how you're doing it is not in line with the principles and is causing damage.
No, that's really, really important. And it really ties me to this concept of responsible business and being a change maker around responsible business. So, earlier you talked about the early parts of your career, citing Oman and citing Nigeria. But then what does responsible business really mean in this case to you?
Well, first of all, about Changemaker, of course, there aren't any individual change makers. All change makers have to work, it's we. If you want change, other people have to join. It's a collective team building process, so it's not one individual. I think when it comes to responsible business, I've been a long-term passionate supporter of responsible businesses working in what I call difficult countries, countries whose human rights record is not perfect, who maybe have corrupt societies, who maybe don't permit labor unions. And I believe that through the example of a responsible company, we can spread the word. But that begs the question, what is a responsible company? And I think the answer is one that's completely transparent about its work and what it's doing. What are you doing in country X? How do you know that you're doing good? And that means engaging not just with your shareholders, but with human rights organizations, the labor movement, because, as an example, through the Global Compact, I remember having a Global Compact meeting in China, and the labor organizations who attended it said, we only got here because of the Global Compact. Last time we tried to come, they didn't give us a visa. But we gave a framework, and that's what's so important, is to bring the collaboration together.
I want to go back to a point that you mentioned, that one can't be a change maker alone. Over time, who have you brought together in building this? Today we call it a stakeholder universe. Who have been some of these key stakeholders and over time in your career?
Well, in Shell, we had a terrible year in 1995. Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed in Nigeria, and we had the Brent Spar environmental issue with Greenpeace. And even our friends thought we hadn't handled it very well. We had, since the 70s, strong principles, which interestingly, as an example, were created not by someone in the executive committee, but by an individual next layer down. We had to return to those principles and go to organizations, local governments, NGOs, academics, media people. I think we ran 80 workshops around the world with 12 Shell people, slice across the company from top to bottom. Nobody attended more than one. 12 external, and asked them, okay, here are the principles we had. What do we need to do so that they're fit for the 20th century, late going on 21st century? And they all engaged, and they came up and they gave us 3 things which we needed to change. One was on human rights, expressing support for what we called fundamental human rights. One was clarifying our role as a political actor, which is extremely important because we always said we're not involved in politics and we don't bribe people. And they said, pull the other one. Of course you're involved in politics. You are a political actor. And we said, well, that's not what we mean. So they said, say what you mean. And the third, which is the most difficult, was a commitment to sustainable development. And then we went back to them and said, how's that? And they said, pretty good. We don't think you can do better. But they're just words. So now report on it and prove it. And that's where the Shell report in 1998 and 99 came.
Well, that's really pioneering, and I think it was probably really bold and brave for the company at that point in time to open up to such a broad group of stakeholders. And as we said, it's just really important to be transparent and inclusive in what we do.
I think the companies are always worried, and that was absolutely true of Shell. It took ages before we first published our safety statistics, because people within the company would say, if we put that out, people will realize that so many people die in the operation. And when we put it out, nobody did that. They were just delighted because we'd published it, and now, subsequently, they could follow and say, are you getting better?
And I know it also, we hear that from the Global Compact, that level of transparency also opens up the door for other companies to report similarly, and also to, put in place standards for what should be done. It could be around fraud and corruption, it could be health and safety, many issues.
And the bar gets higher and higher. It's the ratchet effect.
And that's truly the importance of transparency. I wanted to move a little bit to the times that we are in right now. It's truly turbulent times globally, end of March 2022. I recall 2020 when the Secretary General, called on the decade of action to deliver the SDGs. And shortly thereafter, the COVID pandemic hit. Since then, we've seen the climate crisis continue to get worse. We've seen rising inequalities and the breakdown of social fabric, in many instances. But I think more importantly, at this point in time, there's probably never been as many cases of civil strife and war globally. Looking back, there's still Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Myanmar. Today, it's the Ukraine. So the question we ask ourselves right now as the Global Compact is, what can and should business be doing in such turbulent times? And really, how can one be a leader successfully in such high-risk environments, where you're dealing with perhaps fragile governments, fragile states, authoritarian politics, unknown geopolitical environments? What really can leaders hold on to in terms of a framework for responsible business?
I think going to the urgency, and if you look at climate, we have wasted an enormous amount of time not uniting civil society and business. So the first step to me in the urgency is to try and form a coalition. I think the other issue is that we are actually at a turning point in the world between authoritarian governments and so-called democratic governments. I have always been careful in talking to governments around the world to try and not use the word democracy, because it is loaded. The United States thinks it's a congressional democracy. We Brits think it's a parliamentary democracy. I say, let's just talk about popular participation. And then everyone gets it, because even autocratic leaders listen to their population. So if you talk about the need to listen to populations, it's fundamental. I gave the example of Oman. The Sultan of Oman, Sultan Qaboos, in 40 years, went from this medieval country to a country with a bicameral parliament, with elections. So I think talking about participation, and that China is passionate about this involvement, this society which is at ease with itself. In this part of the world, we have majlises, rulers who are open you can go and see the emir and say, I don't like what your minister is doing. And ministers don't like it at all. So, you know, we might say that's not democracy, but it is popular participation, and we need to learn from each other about this, and our democracies are far from perfect.
And just a little bit then about the interplay of business and government. And you talked about the very many different shapes that government and popular democracy can play. I think what we see oftentimes is business leads, a couple of key policy issues. We've talked about climate and the role that private sector has played in that. I mean, where do you see the ideal balance between business, public policy, and government? What would that look like in the ideal state?
Business people sometimes say, we really need small government, little government. I say to them, you've never lived in a country where the government has collapsed. You know you miss it then. If business associations go to a government and say, we think what we need is the following. The government thinks, well, I've better listen to business, otherwise they'll take their business somewhere else. But what's society in general going to think about in things we need to do to drive climate policy? Incentives or disincentives, people worry about it raising things. If we're going to make progress, we need to get civil society, labor organizations together. And that's the brilliance of the local networks of the Global Compact, because there you have a coalition who can go to the government and say, look, we represent business, civil society, labor organizations. And those three, frankly, keep each other honest. You don't get single-issue NGOs because the others will tell them, be quiet. You don't get individual businesses pushing a particular line, or you get them, but the other businesses say, come on, that's not of general. So I think we have potentially, in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals and other things, a very powerful mechanism which we're not using enough, which is the local networks of the Global Compact. To me, the future of the Global Compact is the local networks.
You've talked about, in your career and just now, the need for business leaders to be able to speak to civil society, to speak to government. Those are truly different skills from what one might learn in business school. So, what should business leaders do?
I always say, teach people to listen constructively, and listen in particular to people who don't agree with you, who are opposed to you. Because even if sometimes we're inclined to think, and we in business can be quite arrogant sometimes, these guys don't understand it really. Even if we think they don't understand it, they have a perception. Where did that perception come from? What sort of signal are we sending by our activities which has caused a big swath of the population to think that business is on the wrong tack? We've got to do something to build the trust.
Yeah, and those are truly unique skills.
Yes. So
Absolutely.
I think number one skill is listen.
So, how does a business leader deal with negative consequences? You've talked about, in your history with Shell, the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa. You've talked about the oil spills. But, what sort of resilience do you need to build up to deal with negative consequences of business?
Well, you have to be prepared to understand that people won't agree with you. The most hurtful thing as an individual is not when people say you're wrong, it's when people assume that your motives are malign, and you, deep in your heart, know that those were not my motives. So when someone else says, yeah, well, they would say that because they want to make more profit just or something. And you know that's not true. That's hurtful. But so you need resilience for that. But otherwise, I think you need to go back and learn the lessons. I've often gone back to our Nigerian experience and said, what would you do differently? And with the revisions we made to the business principles, one of the things we would now do differently comes from the statement in that we will express support for fundamental human rights. In a sense, we did. We called at the time publicly for a fair trial. What I regret that we never did was say, we need a fair trial, and this trial ain't fair.
Absolutely.
So
history.
We need to look at what we've learned.
So looking ahead, statistics tell us that the cost of violent conflict has now reached about $14.4 trillion in 2020. But it's not simply the monetary cost. We know that that also comes with socioeconomic fragility, displacement, and many other issues. So amidst this context, Sir Mark, what must we do to advance sustainable development?
Well, going back to your statistics, one of my heroes is someone called Steve Killalay. He's an Australian, and he set up, with the assistance of the Economist Intelligence Unit, something called the Global Peace Index, and then the Institute for Economics and Peace. And it's absolutely brilliant, because by having a rigorous measure of peace, how many people are in prison, not just absence of war, but what social reflections of violence, and he ranks countries. And one of the great things is, and demonstrates, how much money they would save and what the economic consequences of moving up this. I mean, I forget the exact statistics, but if you can go from number 30 to number 20, it puts quite a lot on your GDP. And it's got countries competing. So they compete to move up the Global
ranks.
Peace Index, a bit like they do on the Global Competitiveness Index.
Yeah.
It's a great innovation, fantastic work.
It really is. I mean, that sounds like just a way to really reshift the focus, because I think one of the challenges and what we say in the UN, it's not necessarily the lack of resources, it's how they are and where they're positioned and how you get them to really focus on delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals and key priorities. I still feel sometimes, Sir Mark, that a lot of our reactions and actions are responsive. It seems like we're in catch-up mode. How can we stop this rat race? What do we need to do to just be more proactive? Would that be possible at this point in time in business?
This has to be done on a country-by-country basis, which is, again, going back to the local networks. So I've engaged with quite a number of local networks, and I've always said to them, what are the two most important issues in your country? What do you think it is, and what can the collective activity do about it? And that, I think, is very important and can engage unions, academics, so we can measure progress against the Sustainable Development Goals, against those measures, but we can't address them all of us, all the time. So if you can identify issues, I remember coming to this part of the world many years ago and asking them that question, and they said two things. One is energy, use of, do we waste it? Do we use too much of it? Are we changing enough? And the second is working conditions for migrant labor, which is hugely important. And you know that looking around the country at the moment. And progress has been made, but more needs to be done in this part of the world generally.
Yeah, I really do like the fact, Sir Mark, that you continuously reiterate that we do have global challenges, but a lot of the solutions rely at the local level.
Yeah, it's step by step, country by country by country.
And that's a really, really important reflection, I think, for businesses as a whole. So I want to move to probably our closing section, which is what I call the lightning questions section. It's a little bit like a quiz, but if you could share with me, I guess, what comes to mind first in these 4 short questions. Where do you take inspiration from? What leader, what organization continues to inspire you?
Well, I've taken inspiration from the mining industry. Bob Wilson, who was chief executive of Rio Tinto, and an NGO person, Richard Sandbrook, founder of Friends of the Earth and then director of the International Institute of Environment and Development in the UK, put together a process of looking at what they call mining, minerals, and sustainable development. So bringing together the parties, and out of that grew the International Council of Mining and Minerals. And it's a real, I think, mechanism for change.
I often find some of the hardest questions about the future come from the younger generation. And what can you promise the younger generation? You've certainly done a lot, and you've left your mark already. But what could you promise someone in the younger generation right now about the future?
I think people of my age, and I'm 81, it's difficult to promise people because the world is completely different to the one that we've experienced for most of the time. I think what one can do is challenge them and say, have you actually thought about working in business? Young people are very often ambitious and they say, I'd like to save the world and I want to be involved in sustainable development. Sustainable development, it's a bit like delivering in each country. You have to deliver it in every business, craft, art, dress design, whatever. Find a business and work in business, because business is an essential mechanism of change, for good and bad. So get in there and make it more sustainable.
So last one, we've talked about characteristics for business leadership, and over time you've said, one must be a better listener. Is there anything else you'd add to that for a business leader?
Yeah, I think listening, transparency. Transparency because people are going to find out anyway. So if you're not open about it, you'll be found out. But transparency builds trust, and people talk about authenticity. Authenticity, what is authenticity? It's actually being you and being seen to be you and be perfectly open about your flaws and failings and so on. So I would absolutely put that on the list.
All right, listening, transparency, authenticity. Key chapters for a business school module, no doubt. So Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to share those really insightful lessons with us. Thank you for sharing your views from the past and your intentions for the future and what we must do as responsible business leaders going forward. And thank you really to our participants for joining us today. I think it's been a great conversation. I just want to reflect on a couple of takeaways for me from what I've learned from you, Sir Mark. I think, first of all, what really inspires me is you've worked in challenging industries, in challenging countries, and challenging times. And in spite of all of that, I think what rings true is, as you said, the need for transparency and authenticity in business and taking forward the lessons that have been learned. For me, that's one immense takeaway. I think second is you talked about the skills that are needed for business going forward. And they're not typically your textbook skills. So it's being able to listen more. It's being able to navigate various democratic spaces, I think, and also being open about the good and the bad in your business. I think that's also a really great lesson for going forward. I think the third, Sir Mark, you've talked about, reflecting on the global compact and the work that we do. I think the very fact that we're dealing with global challenges, but those solutions lie at the local level. And I think that really provides a platform for all of us in business to just really allow ourselves to be able to understand local situations, tailor local actions, and act locally. And I think given where we are, 8 years towards the SDGs, I do really think that, global challenges, local solutions will truly help us move forward. So thank you so very much, Sir Mark, for joining me today.
No, and Sanda, thank you very much for having this idea of conversations. And I loved you in the botanical garden, the Arboretum in Kenya. Thank you very much for the time and for your leadership of the Global Compact. It's very important and it's a tough job, and you've had a couple of really tough years. So thank you on behalf of the board and the foundation.